Hello. Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you for joining us here today. Let me remind everyone, please turn your cell phones off or silence them. Thank you. I'm John Lewis Howard, Associate Director of the Murphy Institute. And before we proceed with the lecture, we'd like to read the Tulane Land Acknowledgement. With gratitude and honor, Tulane University acknowledges and pays tribute to the original inhabitants of this land. The city of New Orleans is a continuation of an indigenous trade hub on the Mississippi River, known for thousands of years as Bulbancha. Native peoples have lived on this land since time immemorial, and the resilient voices of Native Americans remain an inseparable part of our local culture. With gratitude and honor, we acknowledge the indigenous nations that have lived and continue to live and thrive here. Thank you. Now allow me to introduce the Executive Director of the Murphy Institute, Dr. Gary Hoover.
Hey everybody, I want to do a couple of things before I get going because I think on the last time I forgot. The first thing I want to do is acknowledge all of the Murphy staff who put these things together. Even though I'm the one standing here, I did virtually nothing to deserve these honors. So my Murphy staff people, if you would please don't try and hide and run away so that people can acknowledge you. There's Catherine in the back. And oh, there she is. So Jennifer, and John Howard, who you already met. All right, so first off, before I get around to introducing the speaker, let me say that if you like this type of programming, the Murphy Institute puts on a lot of said programming just like this. This particular speaker is being sponsored by our Center for Ethics, but we also have a Center for Public Policy Research, and we have a Center for Law and the Economy. All of those centers put on programming just like this, and most of that information about all of our centers can be found on the brochures and the QR codes that are out on that table that is out in the foyer. So if you want to know more about the types of programming that our various centers put on, then please avail yourself of the opportunity to look at the QR code and get a little bit of information. In addition to that, the Murphy Institute sponsors departmental seminar series for economics, the School of Law, political science, and philosophy. So you can attend any of those seminars also. All of those seminars are free and open to the public, and we really encourage our students to make sure to attend any and all Murphy-sponsored events. Okay, with that, let me begin the introduction of Jonathan Simon. So the Murphy Institute Center for Ethics is pleased to welcome Jonathan Simon of UC Berkeley's School of Law as our first featured speaker of the 2024 Public Lecture Series. Simon's scholarship investigates the role of crime and criminal justice in governing contemporary societies, risk and the law, and the history of interdisciplinary study of law. His published works include over 70 articles and book chapters and 3 single-authored monograms. His fourth book, tentatively titled The Carceral Cathedral, is expected in 2025. Get your copies here. No, I injected that. Professor Simon's scholarship has been recognized by the American Sociological Association, who awarded him the Sociology of Law Book Prize, and with the American Society of Criminology's Hindeland Award. Further, Simon's contributions have been recognized internationally with numerous international appointments and fellowship. Today's lecture, Building the Carceral Cathedral, What History Can Teach Us About How and how hard it is to shrink the carceral state draws upon the forthcoming article in Law and Social Inquiry entitled Dignity Defied, Legal Rational Myths, and the Surplus Legitimacy of the Carceral State, and his book, slated to be released next year. Also, Hoove, the reception follows this talk in the Woodland Way. Oh, okay, I'm supposed to tell you that. So this is a note for me to tell you that there is a reception after this in the Woodward Way place. So one of the staff will tell me exactly where that is later, so then I will tell you exactly where that is. But we're gonna have a Q&A afterwards, and at that point, I will direct you to the reception. But for now, let us welcome Jonathan Simon.
Thank you so much. First of all, to the Murphy Institute and to the Center for Ethics for hosting me. I'm deeply honored to kick off your 2024 season. I'm also very grateful to be brought back to one of the most beloved cities in the world for me, New Orleans. As you may know, in most of the rest of the country, in mid-January can be a kind of melancholy season. All the big holidays are behind you. They're taking down decorations. Nothing to look forward to other than pseudo-holidays like Valentine's Day. Here, things are just building up toward the big event, so it's a very cheerful time to be here, and I'm honored. So I want to start just a little bit of sort of a linguistic note-keeping here. The word carceral state can be a very off-putting one, first of all, and a misleading one. First of all, our system of punishment includes a lot more than just incarceration, but I'm using that term to kind of capture the larger set of institutions that exercise the power to punish. And carceral state, and a lot of people have made these points in print, I'm just acknowledging them, gives a sense of kind of coherence to the carceral state as if it was, a central committee, which it isn't. It's a very, like everything else about American government, very fragmented and often at war with itself, so it's not so holistic as my term might suggest. Nonetheless, it's a good shorthand that helps to remind us that at the end of the day, when we talk about punishment, even though sometimes philosophers, and I don't want to pick fights with philosophers because I know a lot of them are in the room, tend to treat crime as if it was an interpersonal event with moral implications, which of course it is. But in our societies, it's also a deeply state event. And the state, as we'll talk about, has come over the last 900 years to not only put itself at the very center of crime and punishment, but to use that centrality to build what we might call a kind of civic religion or civil religion of the state, which makes it very appropriate to be in this lovely chapel today, even though I will not be, nothing I say will be sectarian in any traditional religious sense. So let me see if I can get this right. There we are. So most of what I'm going to say today is on the depressing side, because I'm really thinking a lot about how hard it is to transform, shrink, let alone abolish the carceral state. And if you had invited me, 10 years ago after I published my third book, Mass Incarceration on Trial, which was partly sparked by the Brown versus Plata case, a US Supreme Court decision which kind of ended mass incarceration in California, at least put us on a trajectory down, and I hoped would be a kind of wake-up call to America that this was a deeper problem in our democracy and our system that we had to contend with. After all, the 1980s through the 2000s, which Hoove and I lived through, but many of you clearly are newer folks than that, saw an unrelenting pattern of expanding punishment in America. California and Louisiana, as different as they are in so many ways, followed a quite similar trajectory. Each of them essentially quintupled its scale of imprisonment during those years, with nary a break in some 37 years of expanding prison admissions. But beginning around the time of Brown versus Plata, beginning of this decade, we could talk about really when it began, the sort of reconsideration or reckoning, you might say, with this surplus punitiveness of our society. We had really a decade of reform. Now looks like a decade of reform because I worry that it's coming to a close. But at least at the beginning of it, I thought there was reason to believe that this could be a really decisive turning point. And much of what happened for the rest of the decade was consistent with that. We saw a vibrant social movement grow up around the problem of police violence, in particular racist police violence. We saw states like California and Louisiana pass legislative packages aimed at moving away from incarceration. Here in Louisiana in 2017, you passed a package of reforms that have at least modestly reduced incarceration in the state. And I believe, I was telling Hoove, given up Louisiana's championship of incarceration rates in the United States to Oklahoma, which I believe is now #1 and you're #2. So still not great company to be in, but it's in the right direction. And of course, with the murder of George Floyd in the spring, summer of 2020, we saw the largest social movement in the country in decades, and it was squarely focused on the legal system, the police, broadly speaking, the carceral state. But starting with about 2021, I fear we're experiencing something of a rebound. So let's just take a look at the period of decarceration. Thanks to the Vera Institute, I can show you a nice graphic of Louisiana's prison population, not a rate, but you can see that long, I guess there were some ups and downs in the beginning of it, but since the early 80s, pretty consistent trend line up that only really comes to a close in about 2009, 2010, modest decline, and then I think with the 2017 package and maybe anticipating that, a somewhat sharper decline. So you can see California, although much larger, you have about a tenth the size of the prison population that California does. Of course, we're a much, much bigger state. We still have a much lower incarceration rate. But you can see a similar pattern. In fact, during the 80s, you can see California experienced a dramatic increase in incarceration. I'm not quantitative, but the slope of that first part of the curve is not something I'd want to ski down, let's put it that way. It's a very extreme rate of growth. In the 90s and early aughties, it sort of leveled off some, but stayed high and stayed going up really until the court's judgment in Brown versus Plata began to be clearly imminent, and the system began to find ways to reduce its prison population. So already there are signs that this rate of decarceration is turning around. The federal government's 2023 report on prisoners, the American prison populations in 2022, listed Louisiana as one of the states that's where the prison population is growing again. Nationwide, actually, it grew at about 2%. Louisiana grew at 4%, so roughly twice the growth rate. California, it's still going down, but there are reasons to believe it could go back up again. More importantly, perhaps, the politics of law and order that have gone along with the rise of mass incarceration seem to be revitalizing. Here's California's very liberal governor for now. He clearly wants to be president, but doesn't seem to have a path at the moment to get there, but has given a recent statement in support of a new set of harsh laws that would enhance prison sentences for fentanyl dealers, apparently disregarding the long history of trying that with crack and heroin and other drugs, telling reporters, quote, "The war on drugs has worked in the past." Of course, he says he doesn't want to do the old war on drugs. He's going to combine his war on drugs with treatment and help. But it looks a lot like the old war on drugs. In fact, during the last year, with the governor's help, San Francisco engaged in a crackdown on open-air drug dealing, which has resulted in a lot of people going to jail, very few people going to treatment, and an increase in overdose deaths, sadly, in the same year that they were cracking down. Louisiana is also not immune to this. This was January 12th of this year. Louisiana legislature looking at undoing one of the reforms passed in 2017, which essentially raised the age at which juveniles could be tried in adult court. And I guess looking now back at this sort of decade of reform, my fear is that we've succeeded in making mass incarceration a stigmatized concept. Nobody's for mass incarceration at this point, but there's a lot of people who claim that we can punish without doing mass incarceration. And so what we see is punishment, and this is something I'll be talking about this afternoon, able to kind of shed the clothes of its most recent presentation and essentially represent itself in a new light now, say, as a rehabilitative effort rather than a throw away the keys sort of effort. So, why is it so hard? We seem to have a consensus for a minute that we needed to do something big with policing and with prisons. And very quickly, within months after the sort of peak demonstrations in the summer of 2020, we began to see signs of a backlash, a revitalization. Despite all the talk about defunding the police, I'm not aware of any place that actually took money away from police. And many of them have thrown more money, and we're doing that in San Francisco as well. So why is it so hard to reform, let alone abolish this carceral state, which, to remind you, is a real set of institutions: courts, police, prisons, and many other things? And I just want to remind you of a few of, I think, the kind of explanations that many of us in criminology, in the sociology of law, might turn to, and also invite your own thoughts about what might be the reason for it. So one is that the institutions and the workforces that make up the carceral state are extremely well organized. California has famously the super powerful union that's able to, a guards union that has very much influenced public policy in this period and has influenced the governor, our current governor, with their donations very much. And they're not willing to give up the political gains that they made during the sort of punitive turn era, and they're effective at shutting that down. Another possible explanation is that we simply live in what political scientists might call a right-of-center country when it comes to crime policy. Americans are just more punitive than other folks around the world, and I could argue with that in terms of our own history, but there's, it's consistent with what we're seeing here. Third, there's a lot of fear out there that destabilizing the carceral state, even by talking about reform, leads to more crime. This is sort of the Ferguson effect story. Well, if you criticize the police, you're going to get hurt by robbers and worse, right? You're going to de-energize law enforcement. What I want to focus on in this book and in today's talk is ultimately a more cultural and a more, I would say, cognitive issue, which is that punishment enjoys an enormous cognitive legitimacy in thinking about crime and punishment and society that is simply much more resilient than its critics, including myself, have acknowledged over the years. And I want to explain that a little bit more today. So if we ask the basic question, why do we punish? What drives this sort of will to punish? We come up with an interesting, I think, conundrum. While philosophers are often quick to try to define punishment narrowly as having a singular purpose and then seek to reform our current system based on a better understanding of deterrence or retribution or reform even. From my point of view as a sociologist of law and of crime and punishment, this quest to come up with a clear definition may be a good aspiration, but it simply doesn't fit with the history that we have lived, in which various multiplicities of punitive purposes have emerged and really remained, and this gives the carceral state an enormous amount of resilience. And here I want to just remind you of, I think, a critical insight from the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who was really one of the first scholars to begin writing, I should say, about punishment from a more critical perspective in his Genealogy of Morals, and particularly the second essay on guilt and bad conscience. There he notes that and I'll just read you part of this quote, the history of punishment up to now, in general, the history of its use for a variety of purposes, finally crystallizes in a kind of unity which is difficult to dissolve back into its elements, difficult to analyze, and this has to be stressed, is absolutely undefinable. Today, it is impossible to say precisely why people are actually punished. And he suggests that you simply can't define an institution that has had the kind of history that punishment has. And I actually think that the term crystallization captures for me the way in which this institution, the carceral state, has been able to consolidate its hold by having not one, but really multiple values that it promotes as integral to what it is. And that simply gets missed if we try to define it more narrowly. So let me come to this very much metaphor of the carceral cathedral. First of all, this is not a rant against organized religion. I love cathedrals. Whenever I tour the world, I go to the local cathedral and try to understand the development of that society, that place through the cathedral. But what I think it captures well is the enormous historical longevity of the carceral state. The carceral state as we know it began in the 12th century in Europe. And like a cathedral, it has literally taken centuries to build. That's one of the cool things about cathedrals when you visit, especially the medieval ones. The people who started them knew they weren't going to live to see the end of it. In fact, some of them took hundreds of years to build. They embodied different architectural designs, different building methods, and even different theologies. And I think the carceral cathedral is a lot like that. While at any one time it is integrated by the needs of the system for functionality, it actually reflects deeply different ideologies and beliefs. It also, of course, captures the complexity of the carceral process itself that involves multiple different institutions, multiple different kinds of actors, prosecutors, public defenders, also things that we don't always include in our narrow definition of punishment, including immigration, deportation, and detention, unhoused encampments, which at least in California are made up, a majority of the people in them are people who have been incarcerated at some time in their lives. So I want to sort of explore this carceral cathedral with you, and while it's pretentious to do so, let me offer as a starting point a sort of comprehensive theory, if you will, of penal change. And my contention here is that we often focus too narrowly on the institutions, the prison, or laws like the Three Strikes Law, and we see the carceral state as mainly through its institutions. But I want to suggest that that's really just one of a number of dimensions that have to be thought about if we're going to understand this history. So one of them, conveniently for a place that has a major program in political economy, is the periodic crises of political economy that we get. And I use that term, the term is used in different ways by different people. To me, it's just a reminder that what is economic is always deeply political, right? There are no markets that aren't constituted by laws and institutions. And the political system is always deeply influenced by and shaped by the dynamics of the economy. And I've kind of turned this into something of an admonition here. Over a millennium, all right, 900 years or so, the criminal law and court-ordered punishment of the convicted have become so integral to the meaning of the state and to capitalism that there is no economic or political crisis that is not translated quickly, I would say, into a crisis of crime and responded to with innovations or renovations of the carceral state. So these crises aren't necessarily coming from crime, but they very quickly get defined as that. There we go. So let me talk about some of the other terms here, and I just want to use these as kind of placeholders for thinking about how change happens in the carceral state. So when you have a crisis of the political economy, and I'm going to go through some concrete ones in a moment, the elites in that society tend to look to emerging technologies of power, to use Foucault's expression. These aren't like computer technologies necessarily. They are technologies in the sense of strategic methods for exercising power on populations, on individuals, on everything in between. Elites observe the potential value of this emerging technology of power and try to bring it to bear on the crisis that they're experiencing through the institutions of the carceral state. So think of the prison as related, as we'll talk about in a minute, to the emergence of the disciplines and disciplinary technologies of power that Foucault drew so powerfully in his book, Discipline and Punish. The institutions that we tend to think of as the carceral state to core, like the prison, like probation, like the court system, emerge in a way to implement these new strategies of power, the prison, for instance, with discipline. But, and this is an important caveat, as legitimate and resilient as these institutions look today, if you actually look at their emergence, every one of them was unpopular at first. People resisted the idea of making private justice a public institution. They resisted turning various forms of direct public punishment on a scaffold into the hidden punishment of prison. They resisted the expansion of supervision methods like probation, parole, and the juvenile court at the beginning of the 20th century. And that brings us to our final category, what I'm calling here the rational myths of the carceral state. And by rational myth, I'm taking a term from sociology of organizations that talks about the way that even the most modern organizations, let's say corporations, which you might take to be completely instrumental in their goals, often navigate their terrain, their environment, less by succeeding in producing the outcomes that they desire, and more by creating structures that can align with popularly held beliefs about that institution. So let me give you an example from outside the carceral state. Why do universities in the United States have football teams? Go around the world, you'll not find other societies that have advanced higher education systems that have football teams. And I can't tell you what the whole history of it is here, but I can tell you that the necessity of having a football team for a respectable university has become a rational myth. Very few universities actually make money from their football programs. Often they sink huge amounts of their resources into it. I'm sure there's some Green Wave fans here that are not pleased with me at the moment. We're now going to be in the same league, I guess, so that's good news. But when it comes to these myths, the reason I call them rational is they're not like the ancient Greek myths. They don't require you to suspend your belief in the laws of physics or chemistry. They are often based on rational or rationalistic ideas. Well, I hope this will become clear as we look at some real examples. And I am not going to take you through this massive table, which more or less condenses an entire course I teach at Berkeley into a single matrix. You're welcome to contemplate it later. I'll put it up to maybe trigger your questions. But I think looking just at the totality of them and thinking about the layers we're going to look at here in a kind of archaeology of the carceral state, one way to understand, this kind of cuts to the chase for those of you that are nodding off now and will nod off further as I get into the historical details, you can at least take away this argument. One of the reasons, or one of the main reasons I would argue that it's so difficult to shrink or transform the carceral state is that it reflects not just ideas about punishment, but really thinking about the technologies of power. The integration of every major innovation in state power, more or less since the Middle Ages. So when we're contending with the carceral state, we're contending with a kind of condensation of the entire political history of the West in its power mode, and a complementary set of myths that provide, as it were, a shifting set of repertoires of roles of which the carceral state can be said to somehow be serving us. So let me, and with apologies to those who don't care for history, of course we're in one of the most historic cities, so shame on you, should be interested in history. But I want to start with essentially the late medieval period, and I won't be able to go into great detail on any of these, but this is a moment that I think legal scholars and criminologists in particular need to study a lot more. So this is a crucial moment in the history of Europe and European politics where crime and punishment go from being largely a private affair. And I don't necessarily mean just private individuals. Feudal life isn't like that, but families, clans, villages, territorial power holders, not sovereigns in the way that we think of today, the crown prosecutor or the people, representing the people as a prosecutor. Instead, crimes are dealt with by vendettas and typically, mostly in the end, by compensation, negotiated forms, mediated forms of compensation. But in around the 12th century, fueled by some really amazing developments in European history, the so-called rediscovery of Roman law. Who lost it, I'm not sure, but somehow in the late 12th century in Bologna, apparently, they did find an intact copy of essentially Justinian's Code, which is represented here in an early publication version, which basically offered a model. It basically was a sort of hologram of the Roman legal system, and it wasn't so much that the Roman laws, which were listed there, were particularly helpful to medieval European society. They were, in fact, quite inapt. But what it did provide was a crystal model of what you might think of as a kind of rational legal system with an emperor at the pinnacle, a singular legal source who then essentially represented the law. The church under Pope Gregory was one of the first institutions to sort of absorb Roman law and to rationalize its own canon legal system. And again, the problem in the medieval period wasn't too little law, it was really too much law. There was the law of this monastery, the law of this cathedral, the law of this town, etc. And notice that if you have that kind of a pluralistic legal system, it's pretty hard to create a capitalist economy, right? Because what's property, what's contract, etc., if you don't have a singular legal definition of those terms. So this is a huge takeoff. I would argue that in many ways there is no capitalism or colonialism without this moment, because it was essentially rationalizing the law that gave European states the ability to accumulate both power and capital. And we see an important shift in the meaning of political leadership in this period. Kings in the middle medieval period, throughout the Middle Ages up to this point, tended to offer themselves as essentially representatives of God. Not just that God appointed them, but they were sort of like in touch with God, was a representative of God. And of course, this put them into considerable tension with the Pope and the Church. And this is a complicated story I'm condensing here, but pretty much at the end of this period, and Ernest Cantor, which has studied the king's two bodies, has a lot of evidence of this. You see monarchy sort of move in its symbols and its representations from basic religious appeals to the idea that the king is the embodied law. And so while you can't be the Pope, you can be essentially like a Roman emperor in terms of having absolute control of the law within your territorial domain. So how does this get this, and by this I mean the idea of sovereignty, which is really what gets invented at this moment with the idea of state power and law being integrated into a singular apex, with a hierarchy with an apex. How does this get institutionalized? In a variety of ways. You get courts who are now royal courts or national courts. You get prosecutors who it takes a while to develop in England, but certainly on the continent. You get public prosecutors who replace the victim as the primary agent of addressing crime. This is a moment that again we skip over when we teach criminal law, that we began to think of crime not as an injury to a particular person, but as an injury to the king. Right? In English law, we say, he breached the king's peace. When you broke into that house, you shattered people's confidence that the king's law was controlling. Law, in effect, becomes kind of like a religion, but a secular religion of state power. You get the birth of the trial, right? When you have private justice, no need for a trial. Often it's resolved in a duel or a contest that God will essentially adjudicate. But with the takeover of crime and punishment by the state, you now have to have a trial. And a number of historians point to the trial as one of the origins of the experimental method in science. So if you believe that, this is not only the birth of capitalism and colonialism, but also modern science and technology as well. If law is a religion, punishment is its most important ritual. It's most important. You only have, how often are you going to have a royal coronation or a royal funeral or royal marriage for that matter? Not very often. But execution time, where the king's agents will publicly dismember somebody who has violated the king's honor, is a powerful and very public ritual of the sort that you see going on here in 18th century France. So we have, fortunately, through art, a powerful picture of what this new structure of power looked like to Europeans just a couple of centuries after the rediscovery of Roman law. What you're looking at here, and you won't be able to see the details at this distance, but I invite you to, check this out at home on your computer. It's an amazing series of frescoes painted by Ambrogio Lorenzetti in 1338. They still exist in the Palazzo Pubblico in Siena, Italy, called The Allegory of Good and Bad Government. And what you're looking at here is the allegory of good government. And I don't have the time to take you through all of it now, but let me just sketch the picture of punishment and state power that it reflects. Here you have the sort of king, the figure of the king. It's actually, Siena had one of the first city councils, so he's really representing the commune of Siena. And indeed, these frescoes are right outside the city council chamber, right? So they were actually supposed to be a lesson for the councilors going to do their work about how they should act and what the consequences were. And what you see is parallel to the sort of kingly figure on the other side of the image is the sort of divine reflection of what this is about. You see a figure of justice seated in a throne. If you could look closer, you would see that she's got angels on both sides of her. On one side, on her right side, they're delivering penal justice by beheading a criminal. On the other side, they're sort of doing civil justice by resolving disputes between merchants. At the bottom, you see the citizens of Siena, who are thought to be, in a sense, the connection between divine and secular justice. Sitting alongside, this is an allegory, which means every image in it represents something, and I won't tell you all of them. But what's important is that the figures on both sides of the kingly figure represent the virtues of good government. And the most important one is on the far left of the figure, who represents justice. And while you can't see it, it's too small, you maybe can see it a little bit. She's got a beheaded head in her lap, right? Just to remind you that this is crucial to having a good government. And indeed, to make that point clear, at the bottom, sort of paralleling the line of citizens, you see a line of prisoners, including a black-capped prisoner who's the capital prisoner who's going to be executed. So what you're looking at here is kind of a machinery of punitive justice. And if you could see the other frescoes, what he shows you then is like, what are the effects of good government on city and in country? And in the city, you see prosperity and trade going on. In the country, you see prosperity, farms, rich farms. And there's a lot of images of punishment, including a figure, a winged angel who's carrying actually like a guillotine in that image. It's, of course, contrasted with the allegory of bad government, and that's a fascinating image. But the bottom line is, when you look at the city and the country in bad government, which means non-punitive government, it's chaos, anarchy, violence, burning cities, abandoned farms, etc. So The myth of sovereignty, as I would call it, the rational myth of sovereignty, is that punishment repays a debt to society, and that the failure to collect that debt leads to disorder, economic decline, and ultimately social collapse. And it's a rather complicated metaphor. We still use it when we talk about somebody as having paid their debt if they've served a prison sentence. It obviously made some sense in the world of private justice, but when it gets transposed onto the world of public justice, it has an interesting and problematic feature, which is how much do you owe, right? If your harm is done to another human being, there's a kind of tangible metric that we can use to say, well, what is owed here? But if there's an ontological gap, if the entity that you've harmed is not another human being, but is God, or in this case, the state in its kind of divine role, then the sky is the limit in terms of how much punishment might be seen as necessary. And I think this is what I think of as the big bang moment of the punitive or carceral state. That is, the full extent of punitiveness that we see in the era of mass incarceration, I would argue, is already implicit in this model. It's just that the state is too weak and doesn't have the right kinds of methods or technologies to actually punish all the people who need to be punished. And if you look at the history of criminal law in these periods, there's tons of amnesties and pardons. There's all kinds of ways that the system avoids having to punish people because it really can't, doesn't have the resources. But in terms of desire, the desire to punish comes into full bloom at this point. So let me skip ahead 400 or 500 years to the arc of discipline. If you've read Discipline and Punish, Molosi and Pavarini's The Prison and the Factory, or any of the numerous studies of the emergence of the prison in the late 18th, early 19th century, this will be a relatively familiar story. What is the crisis of political economy that it is addressing? Primarily what Marxists might call the crisis of primitive accumulation capitalism. That is, how do you turn a feudal workforce into an industrial proletariat in a couple hundred years? And this is expressed in a variety of political problems of the era. This is the time of proliferating property crime. Property crime is not so important in the sort of early stage. It's mostly focused on violent crime. But this, at the beginning of capitalism, makes property crime incredibly available and important. And indeed, Patrick Colquhoun's late 18th century treatise on the police of the metropolis is all about the enormous impact that thievery can have on the emerging economy. He was an expert on ports, and he was convinced that unless you had a police force, that the workers in the ports would steal a great deal of the product in a way it offered an opportunity for workers to reappropriate the surplus value that the economy took from them. It's also the era of revolts of the poor. There are, in the period leading up to the French Revolution, numerous violent uprisings by poor populations largely displaced from their rural subsistence lives by the emergence of a property system of commodity. This is also the time where you get the idea of dangerous classes, because large numbers of people pushed out of the country are ending up in cities that don't yet have the industries that will eventually employ people like that, and so you get the accumulation of people who look to elites like a dangerous, unreliable class. So that's our crisis. And you know something about the new technology of power that gets brought in by political authorities in this period to address it. It's the disciplines. Foucault, in his analysis of them, emphasized the role of surveillance, creating hierarchical observation over workers, over people being punished, over students. It's corrective training, right? We're not just going to punish people by hurting them or mutilating them. We're going to subject them to coerced labor that will teach them correct habits. We're going to examine them to decide if they're safe or if they've achieved enough. Bentham's Panopticon, one of the first and most influential designs for prisons, although it was never built exactly on this level, pretty much embodied these ideas. You would put people in this structure, you'd maintain surveillance over them, you would put them at work to do things that would correct them, and you would examine to see if they were, in fact, heading in the right direction. The institutionalization of the disciplines as a carceral state enterprise includes, obviously, the prison, but many other proximate institutions, workhouses and poorhouses in which people are set to work under these conditions. Slavery, if we look closely, like Walter Johnson has, at how slavery was operated, it was not, as once was thought by historians, a sort of throwback to feudalism. It was one of the most intensely capitalist organized sectors of the economy. In fact, the Mississippi Valley, if you look at the steam engines that were going up and down it, was the most heavily capitalized part of the American economy, much more so than the linen mills in places like Lowell, New York, Massachusetts. This is the era of penal reforms. Beccaria doesn't quite anticipate the prison as it will take shape, but he does believe in very clear and easily understood laws that are transparent and visible and can be used to shape people's behavior in a more thoroughgoing way. One of the first really economic thinkers about crime and punishment. So what's the myth, the rational myth that has been left behind by the marketing of the prison and other disciplinary institution? Well, in its most general sense, simply the idea that punishment reforms wrongdoers, and especially in this time in particular, although we really haven't abandoned this idea, it's the idle poor who are imagined as the main source of crime and criminality. The idle rich are okay. They're kind of considered to be moral enough that they won't succumb to the temptations. But it's the idle poor, and to get a flavor of this, you can take a look at Colquhoun's book, which is all online now, and he talks about how idleness is bad to begin with, but then when you do things like go to the pub and start drinking, filling the time of your idleness with even worse behaviors, you find yourself on a path toward crime. This was well captured by the artist William Hogarth, famous for many of his, they weren't lithographs, but he worked on plates that could then be produced into printed material. In this case, one of his most famous ones, Idleness and Industry. Here you can see two apprentices working at looms in what appears to be a textile factory or textile manufactory. And one is industrious, and at the end of 13 plates, you see that he ends up being Lord Mayor of London. And the other is an idler who takes every opportunity to goof off. He ends up being hanged at the end of the series. So you have this very clear picture that if you want to have a society of hard, effective workers, you need to encourage industry, and you need to do everything you can to repress idleness. So I want to turn another century ahead to what I call the arc of eugenics. And this may be a little different use of the term eugenics. We tend to think of that as a now discredited theory of biology and social conditions. But I want to argue that it's part of a larger strategy of power, technology of power. What's the crisis that it aims to address? Well, a later stage of capitalist development, not the beginning when you need to put together a workforce, but sort of a later stage where you have mass concentration of capital into enterprises like Henry Ford's River Rouge automobile manufacturing plant in the 1930s, where everything that was needed to put a car together was all being made in one gigantic factory. But along with that enormous economic power came a whole set of social challenges that were viewed as potentially endangering the economy, mass immigration, mostly from Europe and also from Asia on the other coast, the migration within the United States of Black Americans from the South into the urban North, the concentration of capital and the closing off of opportunities for small businesses, and of course the radicalization of the working class. One of the reasons that Ford's model of an all-in-one factory in a way died out is because it was too vulnerable to a workforce literally taking it over, right? You'd have so many workers on one site that no level of police could necessarily prevent that. So that's sort of the crisis that sets the need for a new renovation of the carceral state, but what do they turn to? And here I want to talk about eugenics as a technology of power. So we tend to think of eugenics, as I said, as a discredited biological theory, but if we think of it more broadly, first of all, it's the beginning of thinking about human biology as really a target of government. And there are many different ways in which that might be expressed. At the height of the eugenic era in the 1910s and 20s, these approaches included individualized removal of people who were considered degenerates and defectives. I'll talk in a moment about the sterilization and asylums that were built to house so-called degenerate defective individuals, but also the mass exclusion or segregation of so-called inferior racial groups, which included people from the wrong parts of Europe, everywhere in Asia, everywhere in the global South for the most part. The kind of inventor of eugenics, or the main promoter of it, Francis Galton, is a really interesting figure. He's a polymath who made numerous contributions to modern science. Some of his work on statistical methods of analysis remain integral to how we do statistics today. He was very interested in law enforcement. He's one of the inventors of the mugshot. You can see his own face in the mugshot. He helped to refine techniques of fingerprinting. But he's most influential in this story for inventing the idea of eugenics and promoting the idea that most things we think of as social problems, crime, poverty, mental illness, are really products of inherited traits, and that a deft use of legal authority to both go after defective individuals and keep out defective populations could result in a very rapid improvement of society. And it's interesting in terms of the theme of religion. While the story of sovereignty and discipline are both explicitly religious, the prison is promoted by Quakers and other dissenting Protestants who really believe in a sort of gospel of rehabilitating people through hard work and thrift and things of that nature. Galton is completely secular, but he says in one of his books that eugenics will achieve what the Bible only promised, which is the perfectibility of humankind, right? And I think we find that as a theme running through the history of the carceral state. We might think of it as, in its most negative aspects, as repressive, et cetera. But the goal is always to build a better human race, right? So that gives it this very positive feature. The institutionalization of eugenics is, to me, one of the most important stories that I hope to call more awareness to through the book and the article and talks like this. In many ways, the first decades of the 20th century are a legal revolution in the United States, and it takes place around eugenics. So take prohibition, right? It never occurred to me that prohibition was about eugenics, but in fact, historians have shown that the big concern was racial poisoning, that alcohol would both degenerate the individual, but also lead to miscegenation. Alcohol would lead to a weakening of inhibitions and therefore cross-racial dating and reproductive activity that would quickly degenerate the larger population. Think what it took to create prohibition. They amended the Constitution to ban the most popular sort of pastime of most Americans. I mean, we can, we've only amended the Constitution, 32 times or something like that. It's really, really hard to do. And to do it for something as unpopular as that tells you a lot about just how much of an imperative this was seen. Immigration restriction. 1924 sees the end of mass immigration to the United States. A quota system is introduced that limits people coming into the United States to a ratio of their population in the 1860 census, which means before there was much immigration from outside of England, Scotland, and Germany, and Ireland to some extent. So this basically set incredibly low quotas for Eastern and Southern Europe. Hundreds of thousands of people coming in one year, the next year, hundreds. So it's a very important moment. It's the birth of illegal immigration in many ways as a problem. And again, it's very much explicitly done on eugenic grounds. If you read the reports and committee hearings that Congress had over the 1924, I think it was even called the Immigration and Nationalities Act, they're very concerned with the sort of racial poison. It's interesting that Trump has reinvigorated the idea that immigrants are a poison to the population. That is a classic eugenic trope, that these folks are actually poisoning. How are they poisoning us? By getting into our reproductive system, into our the production of Americans in a biological sense. This is the birth of the criminalization of race mixing, and Louisiana, New Orleans is a perfect example. There was no segregation legally in New Orleans until around 1924. And of course, the system of enslavement was the opposite of miscegenation laws because it allowed the owner of human capital in the form of enslaved people to force themselves sexually for profit or for pleasure as they saw fit. It's really only with eugenics that the idea that you need to physically separate black and white people becomes a deeply held view. I think New Orleans' first segregation law is passed that year. It's actually struck down by the US Supreme Court on equal protection grounds in 1925. It's a fascinating story. I've not seen any scholarship on that particular case. There must be some. This is the birth of criminalization of sexual conduct. Of course, adultery, abortion, et cetera. There were things that had been historically criminalized, although abortion is very much part of this period. Certainly adultery had been. Same-sex relations as sodomy were criminalized. But those tended to be very religiously oriented laws translated into criminal law. The new criminalization of sexual conduct in the early 20th century, a war on sex workers, on same-sex behavior, queer behavior generally, very much driven on eugenic grounds, that these acts of sexual deviance were weakening society through biological reproduction or the lack thereof. Ironically, it's also from this era that we have some of the criminal justice institutions that even today we think of in very benevolent terms, including the juvenile justice system, probation, parole, which is essentially supervised release following a period of imprisonment, and the use of indeterminate sentencing to sort of match the punishment to the need, the degree of abnormality, in effect, of the offender. And I want to come back to this because when we talk about reducing incarceration today, we often mean what we want to do is expand probation, juvenile justice, et cetera. And if you take this history seriously, that does not necessarily reassure one. In fact, what these systems all shared was a huge amount of discretion. So, being able to put somebody on probation also meant being able to not put this person on probation. And so this is the beginning, especially of the racial disparity in the use of incarceration in this period. So what's the myth of eugenics? The idea basically that punishment can remove the irreparably dangerous from society. And I would say this might be the most tenacious of all the myths that have developed. Very hard to abandon almost any institution that seems to give the state power to get the dangerous few out of our way. And if you have the temerity to bring up abolition as a topic, even among fairly progressive people on criminal justice reform, their first question will be, what are you going to do with the dangerous few, right? And of course, that's it's a worthy question, but one that is too often used to shut down discussion. Now, at the heart of the way eugenics imagined the irreparably dangerous was through what they called feeble-mindedness, what today we might call intellectual disability. And this was again associated with both individual and racial traits. Some races were just considered less intellectually capable or developed than others. Here you can see in this image from Cincinnati's Progressive Era Reformers in 1915, it's a poster titled "The Feeble-Minded." And what you see is a kind of image of a supposedly feeble-minded individual. He looks kind of physically ugly and distorted. He may be an immigrant, but you see him at the hub of a wheel, and those spokes are pointing to the juvenile court, the house of refuge, the jail, police court, workhouse, charity, city hospital, infirmary. In other words, all the social problems in Cincinnati are really about these feeble-minded individuals. It's a fascinating era, and I could go into more detail. There were different ranks of feeble-mindedness: idiots, imbeciles, and morons. Moron, which you probably called your brother a moron at some point. They were the high-functioning feeble-minded, and they were considered particularly dangerous to society because they were almost normal, and they looked almost normal. And in fact, because intellectual disability went along with looser morals, they were more likely to reproduce. And while you might stay away from this guy because he looks clearly abnormal, or in this cartoon does, the moron could be very attractive and seem just like you and me. This continued, by the way, for decades. When my father went through the New York school system in the 30s, he was classified as a moron. He might have had something going for that. He turned out to be a radical activist at some point later in his life. Did eventually get a PhD from the University of Chicago, so maybe the picture wasn't complete, but this was the concern. So let me quickly turn to our sort of most recent arc of carceral state building, what we call mass incarceration. What was this about in terms of a crisis of political economy? Well, I think many students of this subject would consent to the idea that in many ways it's a response to the crisis of Keynesian capitalism, the sort of state-centered form of economic relief and regulation that came to be normalized, especially after World War II in the United States, went along with an era of relatively high wages, relatively increased rights for workers and others. Very much went into a period of crisis beginning in the 1970s. Some of the bullet points here are familiar enough to not need a lot of elaboration. Our cities became incredibly reduced in terms of their industrial workforces. My hometown of Chicago lost something like 500,000 industrial jobs in the 1970s and 1980s. You get the formation of an underclass, or people who are seen as an underclass, largely because they're in the city and all the factories have moved to other places and they don't have the skills or the education or the credentials to enter the new economy of finance, education, et cetera. There are again a wave of urban revolts. Here's the Los Angeles Revolt, also known as the Watts Riot of 1964, which very much sparked a sense that law and order was in danger. You have white flight to the suburbs, and there's I would say the overarching theme of this period, which is interesting to think about today, is the idea of urban crisis. The great American cities are dying. Cities like Chicago, Detroit, New York, New Orleans, San Francisco were seen as fighting for their life because they had been abandoned by the middle classes who were in the suburbs. Indeed, universities that were located in central cities like the University of Chicago, NYU in New York, and maybe Tulane here, you can tell me, literally considered moving to the suburbs in this period because they felt that in the future, middle-class families simply wouldn't send their children into school in these dangerous sort of hell spaces of urban crime and danger. Pretty ironic that now NYU cashes in big time on its urban location, as I'm sure does Tulane and the University of Chicago. So can we think about this period and mass incarceration along the lines of a technology of power? I would argue that what you see here is part of a larger trend in power toward forced removal as a technique of governing, right? So in terms of saving the cities, what's one of the biggest things we see in this era is urban renewal, which when you look at the details of it, turns out to be mainly about deconcentrating black populations in our large cities. If you look at where freeways were located in the big era of freeway building in the 60s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, they always located them right through the heart of the black community, both to drive out those people and to break up those neighborhoods. Of course, creating conditions for future problems of all sorts as those cities struggle to maintain community in the face of those kinds of. And I think we can see, following Ruth Gilmore's work, that mass incarceration is akin to that. It's a way of moving away from just individual level judgment and punishment toward a demographic effort to remove part of the population, to essentially contain the threat that is challenging the survival of these cities. And ultimately, this is institutionalized in the form of mass incarceration. Here again is California's trajectory. You can see that really extreme growth from 1978, which is kind of the bottom, all the way through 2020. Now I see I'm running out of time. So let me, because I think you know this story well, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. We see a massive expansion of police forces. They double, more or less, the size of them. We see systematic use of discretion. All that discretion that was built into the system in the era of eugenics now gets turned toward incarcerating people. So if before we were just incarcerating the dangerous few, now the dangerous few is the dangerous many. There's a huge increase in the length of prison sentences. I don't have to tell you that in Louisiana, where life without parole sentences, like in California, are quite common. And that last bullet point should have said removal of early release mechanisms like parole or pardon. So the myth that goes along with this era of expulsion, which again has its opposition, there's resistance to this, is that aggressive use of punishment can contain the spread of high crime neighborhoods, right? This is part of this fight to save the cities. You got to take the good neighborhoods, downtown, then the good neighborhoods, the Garden District, for instance, or the French Quarter, places that have a sort of viable economic model. And you've got to prevent the bad neighborhoods from taking them over. And police are integral to this. This is, I think, beautifully illustrated by the actual illustration that accompanied Kelling and Wilson's famous article, Broken Windows, the Police and Neighborhood Safety, that appeared in Atlantic magazine in 1982. And if you take a look at that cartoon, it really captures this sense. You've got an urban neighborhood, and you've got all kinds of low-level crime happening around it. There's on the front of that sort of quintessentially urban cafe, there's youth running through the streets. Maybe they're rioters, maybe they're student protesters. There's somebody conducting what might be a drug sale. There's an inebriated person lying down in front of the cafe. On the other side, you've got a sex worker appearing to flag down a customer, and others looking to cause trouble of one sort or another. And the idea was, it still is, that the role police play is not so much arresting people for violent or dangerous crimes. After all, that's hard to do. But instead, aggressively enforcing low-level violations like fare beaters, open container violators, et cetera, with the goal of reinforcing the norms of good neighborhoods in a way that will lead to less violent crime over time. Finally, after a long time of thinking about this sort of chain of history, I began to realize that there really is a trans-historical arc, you might say, of racial governance, especially anti-blackness, that is its own permanent influence on the US carceral state, if not other places. What's the political economy crisis? Well, slavery is a permanent crisis, right? How do you keep a kidnapped workforce productive and not at your throats? And then when slavery is abolished, you get a whole series of versions of racial capitalism that create tremendous disparities of well-being that, again, are invitations to challenge, resistance, revolt. And so over time, the penal system has come to be an integral part of responding to that. Really, from the beginning, there are similarities. So you might compare, as Simone Brown does in her book, Dark Matters, I think is the name of it, the famous image of a slave ship with its detailed diagram of how bodies can be fitted into a narrow space of confinement with Bentham's panopticon and the modern prison. Racial governance also can be thought of as a kind of political technology or a series of political technologies. We see that bring together some of the other ones we've seen, surveillance and management of plantations. I think the Freedmen's Bureau is a fascinating episode here because, again, we tend to see it, even Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois saw it as kind of a benevolent effort to try to bring some measure of justice. But from another perspective, it was a white-dominated institution whose job it was to manage the new racial diversity of a non-enslaved South. And the institutionalization of racial governance in the carceral state is plentiful, right? Ranging from different punishments for enslaved people to the black codes that immediately followed slavery, to the convict lease system and the chain gangs, to the model of discretionary justice in which black people were never given the benevolent probation sentence but always sent to prison, to our own period of mass incarceration. And what's the myth that goes along with this? The idea, and it sounds ironic, but I ask you to sit with it for a little bit. The idea that punishment is actually helpful to managing a racially diverse society. That if you have a racially diverse society, you just need more punishment in order to contain its threat. New York's stop and frisk program in the 90s and aughties is a good example of a repressive criminal technology being used highly specifically against Black and Latin populations with a very explicit goal of sort of managing this racially diverse city in a way that would make it attractive to gentrification and economic improvement. So there they are. I'll just remind you of them, 5 rational myths that I think remain potent in our culture. The idea that punishment repays a debt to society, the idea that punishment can reform the idol or whatever you see as the problem with people who commit crimes, the idea that punishment removes the irreparably dangerous from society, the idea that punishment reinforces the social norms of good neighborhoods, and the idea that punishment manages racial diversity. These are in many ways complementary, can kind of nicely stack them together into the modern carceral state. And sort of my central point about these myths is that one of the things we face when we go through a period like we did in the decade of reform is that we are targeting one aspect of the carceral state, in this case, the huge expansion of incarceration, and the myth that you could make society better by essentially removing whole portions of the population and confining them. You can fight that, and with some success, but don't be surprised when the carceral state comes back at you and says, but we're so good at reforming people. We're so good at removing the dangerous. We're so good at keeping your neighborhood middle class. We're so good at managing racial diversity. So I'll be very brief here. My hope is that we can use this framework, first of all, to think about punishment in other societies. Why does the US have such a so singularly punitive a practice? One reason I believe is that we have more and more virulent versions of each of these myths than almost any other society I know of. A second dimension is the forms, the technologies of power that have become crystallized in the carceral state are, in America, sort of full strength. We have never really diluted them, right? So think about sovereignty, right? I mean, it's hard to think of a country that is more oriented toward its sovereignty, to using its military power around the world as it sees fit, to using punishment at home as it sees fit. If you look at countries that we think of as doing better than us, say Europe, the European Union, one of the things that you might notice is that they don't like to admit it, but they have weakened their sovereignty in order to create the European Union. They've got a structure, a supranational structure that limits sovereignty, or take discipline. The most integral form of discipline, going back to Marx, is wage labor, the demand that you must labor or else you'll starve and your family will starve. Much of the rest of the rich world has created welfare states that don't eliminate that, but greatly mitigate it to some extent, give you more opportunity to resist the demand that you labor at whatever conditions, at whatever pay. Again, the US is singular, I think, in the lack of reducing that marketplace discipline. And then finally, the point I just made, that when you get a crisis of the carceral state, as we just had in the last decade, you're likely to see a revitalization, mostly in symbolic ways, of the previous myths. So let me close, because I do want to end on a more positive note. And I think the reason I'm writing this book is not to discourage activists and others from trying to shrink the carceral state, but to, I hope, equip them with knowledge that will be helpful in understanding what it is that they're fighting and how they need to be able to contest it. So roughly speaking, here are my, Simon's lessons from history for shaping a more abolition-oriented reform agenda. 1, do not focus only on the latest carceral expansion and its institutions, technologies, and myths. Consider the whole ensemble, the whole cathedral. We need to actually attack the myths themselves, challenge them, and not just the institutions. Don't just criticize the police, criticize the idea that neighborhood well-being is conditioned by setting norms to fit one community's idea of what orderly behavior is. Finally, abolition of the carceral state, or even shrinkage of it, must be part of a broad social justice, racial justice agenda that aims at nothing less than upending racial capitalism. And here I'm proud to say that California, even though our governor seems to be reinvigorating the reform model of punishment, indeed he's promised to turn San Quentin Prison into a, quote, wait for it, Norwegian-style re-entry institution, our oldest prison, interestingly. But at the same time, we have a reparations commission, which issued a 1,000-page report on the conditions of formerly enslaved people and their descendants in California and how they were treated. And we're supposed to be now moving on to talking about how to implement their recommendation that reparations be paid in some form to this group. And California's Racial Justice Act, which just happened thanks to the summer of 2020 protests, and we're still seeing it take shape. But many people, more optimistic than me perhaps, believe that it could be a transformative law for California because it allows basically everybody in the carceral state to challenge their conviction, their sentence, or even their arrest on the grounds that it was racially discriminatory, and it essentially takes the limits that the Supreme Court put on how you establish racial discrimination. So there's that frightening grid again, but mostly I just want to say thank you, and I'm going to leave that one up in case it helps to formulate any questions, if I've left any time, and I fear that I may not have.
So, very, very entertaining, very, very informative. Here's what we have. You did not leave very much time. In fact, you left time for one question. And given that I have the mic, I shall ask it. However, we will have the reception right after this, and those of you who don't have the mic can then corner our speaker and ask him all the questions that you'd like. Except, where is the reception that is immediately following this? Where are we having the reception?
So we'll be heading to Woodward Way, which is the hallway right from the
Okay, so it's right on the other side of that building right there. So that's Newcomb Hall right there, and then it's right on the other side of that. And if you not sure where that is, just follow the person in front of you, right? And we'll all end up lost or at the place together. All right, so since we are,
Sorry about that.
that's fine. People are going, they are going to, in fact, you know what? I shall cede my question. I will let us use the mic, and someone else can have the one question I was going to ask. Who would like to have this opportunity here to ask your question?
I'll keep my answers brief, believe me.
Sure.
Okay, is it working? All right. Thank you so much. That was a wonderful talk. And I especially appreciate how you historicize race and the carceral state and embed contemporary politics in this longer history. And my question for you is that the fastest growing prison population is women. And I wonder if there's a way in which history can inform what we're seeing right now. Is there a way in which this story is one of both race and gender? And if you'd like, I can give you a little clue or a little.
Please.
Okay, so like one might be that a disproportionate number of women were subject to eugenic sterilization. So a disproportionate number of black women were subjected to charges of vagrancy after Reconstruction. So are we living in a moment in which, and this kind of goes back to one of your three arguments, or four major arguments maybe at the beginning. You said that one of them is that, are we living in a right of center moment? With Dobbs, with so much going on with women, is there a way in which punishment against African Americans is colliding with punishment of women more generally to incarcerate women of color?
I think that's a fantastic point. As you noted, I mean, when you look at the eugenic era, the largely male prison population is a fraction of the largely female asylum population. We actually mass incarcerate women in asylums to prevent their reproductive activity and then sterilize many of them. I think upwards of 50,000 women were sterilized during this period. So I think women have always been seen in different ways by these different moments as real threats to the sort of social order, political order. It is really interesting that reproductive rights have become back into the sphere of kind of crime control. I mean, after all, 1973, Roe versus Wade happens really just before the beginning of the growth of mass incarceration. And so you have this period of hyper-punitiveness, but in which sort of reproductive activity and to some extent queer sexual activity gets progressively liberalized and legalized. But now we seem to be reversing that. And of course, to the extent that our overall demand for punishment and our sense that punishment is crucial to our social order remains, I fear that we could be in for a real proliferation of new laws, new interventions that are aimed at this. Many of them will no doubt represent themselves as having a rehabilitative or reform-oriented agenda. It's also worth noting that as much as we have tended to focus on men as the major threat of crime, criminology has always been obsessed with women. In fact, Lombroso, the founder of modern scientific criminology, believed that women were the more criminally inclined, because he thought that criminality went along with your sort of more primitive state of development, and I don't know how he worked this out biologically. Somehow he thought women were less evolved than men. He thought the reason they didn't commit a lot of crimes was because of marriage and child care. And so if you take women out of those roles, they're the most frightening, criminals of all. So I do think we need to look at race and gender together at this moment, and I'm just beginning to think about how to talk about the new territory of a sort of criminal abortion as it fits into that story, because it kind of brings together the eugenic moment. It's very interesting here, by the way, that Justice Clarence Thomas has, on a number of occasions, opined that abortion is somehow associated with eugenics. It's completely false. First of all, abortion doesn't stop fertility, which sterilization does, right? If you want to do a eugenic procedure on people, you don't give them abortion rights, you sterilize them. So yeah, and indeed, I would argue that giving women the opportunity to decide when they're going to have children is actually a hugely important, just from a narrow point of view of crime and social order. If you can avoid having people already in poverty born at the absolute worst moments of their mother's life, partners in jail, you become homeless, etc. There's a lot to be said for that.
Well, let me do this. Let me say thank you, because what I want to do, I want to respect everybody's time and also let you know that we will have this reception so that we can keep this conversation going. But for those who have to leave, it's always sort of awkward to walk out when someone's talking. So we will conclude by thanking Jonathan Simon again, and that is the end of this Murphy Talk. Thank you all for coming, too. Appreciate you.